Welcome back. In this lesson, we will get an overview of how identity and access management works in AWS and how you can use it to provide access to your users. Remember, IAM in AWS is a global service. It is not region scoped. So, how do you grant access to a user that needs to access an S3 bucket in order to perform their job function? Well, at the very fundamental level, you must first create them an AWS user account and grant that user account access to the S3 bucket. Pretty simple, right? Well, yes and no. When you first create a user account in AWS, they have no permissions. And in this case, you will need to grant them permissions in order to access this S3 bucket and many more resources. But most likely, they are not the only one on their team. So you might have to give access to multiple team members, and how do you do that without making it repetitive? Well, you can create an IAM group, which gives anyone in that group access to certain resources that they need in order to perform their job function. You do this with the principle of least privilege in mind. And this is basically giving users just enough access to do what they need, not more and not less. But how do you give the IAM group permission? Well, you assign a policy because a policy will explicitly define the permissions for the groups or resources that they are associated with. Now let's talk a little more about users, which is the fundamental part of IAM. And believe it or not, we have already created the most important IAM user, which was the one we first set up when we created your AWS account in the previous video. That IAM user account is your root user account. Your root user account is the most important account, but also the account you should use the least, according to AWS best practices. And that is because it has full permissions over your account. Another best practice is to enable MFA, or multi-factor authentication, on your IAM user accounts. Each IAM user account will get an ARN, or Amazon Resource Name, which will be made up of the user's name and the account number. There's a couple of ways that you can use your IAM user account to authenticate to AWS. That is using the AWS console, through this CLI or command line interface, and through an API. To authenticate through the CLI or an API, we will be required to use the access keys for that specific user account, but we will get into that in a future video. Let's move on to IAM user groups. As we mentioned before, groups are a collection of users. Here we have the admin, the developer, and the finance groups. Each group has its own specific permissions that pertain to their job function and what they need in order to perform their jobs. But a user can be a member of up to 10 groups if needed. For example, if the user is the vice president of IT, he or she may need to be a member of the admin and the developer group to check different things within the AWS account. The main reason we use groups is because it makes it easier to manage users. If we can allocate a user to a specific group, we can know exactly what permissions they have in our AWS environment. Next, we have IAM user roles. This is similar to an IAM user because it is also an identity with permission policies that determine what it can and cannot do in our AWS account. So, what is the point of the IAM role? Well, the difference is that the IAM user role does not have any credentials, basically no passwords nor any access keys associated to it. A role is designed to be assumed temporarily by any IAM user, an application, or service that needs to perform a specific task. For example, let's say that we want to have an EC2 instance access a secured RDS database. Well, we can create a role with appropriate permissions and assign it to the EC2 instance so it has enough access to properly communicate with the database. Finally, let's briefly talk about policies. Policies determine what actions a user, a role, or a member of a user group can perform, on which AWS resources, and under what conditions. They basically define what anyone or anything can do inside of your AWS account. These are JSON-based documents, and JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. We will go in depth on policies in a future video. I hope in this video you learned more about the different building blocks that make up identity access management in AWS, and what you need in order to apply to be able to perform the different tasks in AWS. I'll see you in the next video.